Alright, I was putting together this welding card I got for my birthday from Harbor Freight, so I don't have one, and it's a real pain to move the cylinder and welder around. It seems pretty good, but they didn't include the hooks that go on the side. It's supposed to come with them, and the box was missing them. I didn't realize that until after I'd put the thing together. I called them up. They said they'd give me 2 new hooks if I could show them the receipt, so hopefully my parents still have that. But I guess learning lesson, always just check the box for everything before you do anything with it. Also rolled up the doors today and realized there's a bunch of wasps in here. I smoked them out. That seemed to work, and finished up a couple of them with the wasp killer. I got the fans mounted to the radiator. Got the radiator sitting on new rubber supports. I mean, if I was to put a battery in it and hook these transmission cooler lines up to the radiator, or just loop them for right now and put some oil and transmission fluid in it, it should start. Everything's all hooked up and wired. I guess I need to put the coils back on the rear, and some wires for it, but I guess hopefully this spring break I can at least get it running. I'm going to put the fans on the front because it was easier. Hopefully it'll still move enough air. I mean, it's a really good fit up on the fan shroud here. Had to trim it a little bit to make it fit, but it's still all airtight and everything. So I think I'm gonna see if I can use the factory mount here to hold the radiator, since it's in the factory location. And then the hardest thing I'm thinking about is getting a radiator hose that will fit here good, because it's gonna have to like come off of here but then swoop back and run along the radiator, because the alternator sits here, of course, in the belt, so it can't go there, and then it also has to be able to clear this intake, which I'm probably just going to put a 45 on it and run it straight up through the hood with a big cone filter on it, because that'll look funny. But that radiator hose needs to come off, make a sharp bend back, run along here, and then curve into there. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do there, but hopefully I can find something. Seems like worst case scenario I might have to buy a couple hoses and maybe cut them and splice them together. There'd be a lot more room if I sunk this radiator into the core support and then put the fans on the back side. But to do that, I'd have to basically cut this whole top panel out, cut the side out, and then may have to cut the bottom too and lower it, because by that time you put this over here, I don't know if it would clear the hood, the radiator cap. And then by the time I do all that, I'd rather just buy a slightly smaller aluminum radiator, an aftermarket one, and that just happens to fit in between on the inside of this core support. I mean, they're not that expensive. I would rather just spend the money before I cut the core support all up and make it weaker and then have to come back through and weld metal in. It's just not worth it. Just to use a stock radiator, I would just get something that would provide better cooling anyhow that fits in there. I'm going to try to make this work, because I already have it, and I've seen people do it with recessing this, but I mean, this radiator should keep this engine cool, at least for now. It's just a stock engine. There's no turbocharger or anything on it yet, though I would like to mount one, you know, one here or there eventually, probably after I get a job when I graduate. S10 hold down for the radiator here, but I think there's a difference in the V6 ones, because this is for the 4-cylinder, which is just what we had, but as you can see, it kind of sits up there, which I think is where it's supposed to sit and grab the seam of the tank. But on this side it doesn't, but it does grab it right there. So honestly, I'm probably just going to run with it for now, and maybe next time I go down in the junkyard, I'll see if the V6 one's wider, maybe grab that then. But I actually just cut off the shroud. It was all one part. I just cut it off with a angle grinder, and it worked good. I thought it would just kind of cake the wheel up, but it didn't. It actually cut it fairly nicely. It just deburred a little bit with some coarse sandpaper or something, but I mean, it's plastic, so it's not going to cut anybody for sure. But I don't know if I've shown this, but I've, on these Gen 3, Gen 4 small block Chevys, there's the steam vent that comes out the top of the cylinder head. And instead of, cutting the hose and putting some coupler in with a little nipple coming off of it, I just drilled and tapped the water pump right on this flat surface here, and screwed a barb fitting with some thread sealant on it. And I think that'll work nicely. I'll just get a piece of hose and run it from the outlet here over. This cover's just sitting on here. There's the mess of wires. Oh no, so many wires. It's really not bad. I mean, they're all soldered and shrink tube. I just thought keeping them up under the manifold was a nice place to hide them, basically. Put them under the cover. I may also need to look for a bracket, because I think some kind of bracket off the top of this intake is missing. I mean, I pulled this engine out of a truck years ago, I guess now, so I don't really remember, but you see there's 2 tabs on the back of this intake, and I think there's supposed to be a bracket that this snaps down into, so I have to look for that. These are all unused wires again. I believe they went to the gauge cluster. They were just coolant, temperature and oil pressure wires. I'm hoping one of them will be hot all the time with the key on, anytime the key's on. And then I'm hoping another one is for the starter. And then I'll just get rid of everything else. Same with these. I don't really know what any of them went to. Engine stuff. I have this harness, this micro squirt harness I've got cut down, and it actually just splices back into this little pouch here that will snap up and hold everything very nicely. So this looks a lot more factory, and then I'll get some more conduit and run some of this stuff here for these wires. This is the main power wire that feeds the power distribution block over here. and it has its own cover. And I guess that still needs to be attached, but everything's fused. Either most of all the engine stuff has its own fuse box that I put in the truck, and then there's a fuse I put in line there to feed the ignition coils and the fuel pump. And then the only thing that does not have a fuse is the feed wire from the power distribution box to the fuse box. So it goes, the main feed wire here has a fusible link from the factory S10 that goes on the starter, then that sends power to the power distribution box. That's hot all the time. And then there's a fuse that runs up to a relay, and then that will feed the fuel pump and the ignition coils. So you can't have the fuel pump running without the ignition coils energized, and vice versa. And the reason I did that mostly is that way, you know, if for whatever reason, if I'm upgrading the firmware on the ECU or whatever it be, I can just pull the fuse over there and make sure that the coils and the fuel pump aren't running. Nothing bad can happen. And then there's another wire over there that's not fused, and it runs to a relay, and then from that relay it feeds the fuse box that I put inside the truck. So that's the only one that doesn't have a fuse on it, but they should be fine. I may pick up one of those maxi fuses and put in there. Everything in the fuse box is fused, of course. So I just need to find a wire that's hot with the key on and in the crank position, and run that to the relay to power up the inside fuse box. And then find another wire that I can run over to the starter that'll actually activate the starter solenoid when I crank or turn the key to the crank position. I have the alternator. Inside the truck is definitely a mess, and there's holes in the floor, as you can see. Beautiful holes. It's funny because this truck, for all that I know, was in the South, but these I need to cut back. They're just going to go to the fuse box, but I just recently mounted the fuse panel, so I need to clean this up. The main harness, I've actually just coiled up all the extra wire, and the real reason I didn't want to cut that is because if I end up putting this engine and transmission in a different vehicle, you know, one that I care more about, then I'll have all the wire, and I don't want to have to extend anything. I can just cut it down as needed then. Here's the factory wire harness. I'm just gonna zip tie it up to this rail here, kind of put it back where it was, the factory location. Eventually I would like to go through it and get rid of all the unnecessary stuff. So it still has the keys, and you can lock it. The steering column's not completely bolted in, so I've had to pull the studs out there and extend the holes to try to slide the column over to the passenger or to the driver's side more, so that the steering shaft won't hit the exhaust manifold. You can see it has the manual transmission brake pedal because this truck was a manual, and we were going to use the clutch pedal and the assembly for my buddy's S10 we built. This is actually a 2000, and they changed the dash between the 97 and 2000s, and on the 2000s the clutch pedal just snaps into place where on this 97 has its own dedicated bracket, which is nice in a certain way. If you are building anything, trying to convert it to a manual and get a clutch pedal and bracket out of a 97 S10, and it should work for you. So there's also the hole in the floor for the manual transmission. I'll probably put a plate over it and just rivet it on. Sort of what I did with the firewall block off here. It's just got a sheet of metal and rivet it to the firewall. I still gotta do something with that one. Little stuff, I suppose. This is just gonna be for the oil pressure gauge. I only have one spare input on the micro squirt, so I'm not sure if I'm going to put an exhaust gas temperature probe on, or the oil pressure, or maybe the transmission temperature. But I think with the transmission, I'm just going to put everything through that Arduino that's controlling it, and I can even put, from there I can either just send canned messages back to the micro squirt and then log everything in Tuner Studio, or I could have its own dedicated screen that even tells me the gear, or I could just send the information over to basically my computer that I'll have in the truck that will be handling the display, because obviously I don't have any gauges. So what my plan is to do is get a Raspberry Pi in a case and put a 7-inch touchscreen on it. And with that, I'll mount everything in this area. And I can also hook up a mouse and keyboard to it, but that'll give me, display all my gauges, all the information I care about. I can leave the oil pressure out, or maybe I'll use that ADC pin on the micro squirt to add it as a display. That should be pretty much the plan. This floor isn't too bad. There's a couple small spots, but over here there's obviously a hole, and I'll probably just cut this out, weld in a piece of sheet metal, and then coat the whole floor with either some kind of like bed liner or just some of that Tractor Supply implement paint. It seems to work really well. It still has the door panels, mostly for the fact that it's easier to just keep them, and for things like the crank. If you put just a piece of sheet metal on, one, it's a lot louder and rattly, and then you also have to figure out how to have the rubber here for the window to hold it. I don't plan on putting Lexan in this truck. This is more of just a test bed for the transmission and what I want to do with the engine. So hopefully one day I'll take everything back out of here and apply it to something a little nicer. This is just a cheap project. Try to see if everything works the way I want it to, and learn some stuff, have some fun along the way. You can do things a lot differently and do things nicer, of course, but I don't want to put a lot of money in this project, and as long as it's effective, I don't really care about how it looks, as I'm probably just going to have the exhaust come out the side of the fender here. Also, if you noticed, it has a camouflage paint job on it, which is interesting to say the least. But it should be pretty quick regardless. These trucks don't weigh much, even with a stock motor. With figure with the open intake it'll have and the open exhaust, if I can get the tune dialed in pretty good, it should have right at 300 horsepower, maybe a little less. I think these motors come stock with 275 or 285, so that's probably pretty good, conservative. It also, I don't have the AC drive on it and the power steering, so that frees up some power, and the fan, all that frees up power. Oh, there's another wasp. To get the, that's not even a wasp, that's a, looks like a carpenter bee. Metal building. I don't know what he's gonna do.